So good morning and afternoon and good evening. Really a warm welcome to this IISD Trade and Sustainability Hub meeting. My name is Scott Vaughn. I'm delighted to moderate this session on sustainable trade and global supply chains. Today's panel is being organized by IISD. They're doing a terrific series over the next couple of days on various aspects of the trade agenda. It's being co-organized by IISD and the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. You may hear the acronym CCICED during the next hour or so. And this meeting is part of the ongoing series being organized under this year's World Circular Economy Forum. So we have really an outstanding panel today, 5 main speakers and 2 discussants, and we'll be able to both to listen and learn from them. And I also hope we'll have time to hear your questions, which you can pose in the chat box below. And what we'll try to do is group them at the end of hearing the last two main discussants. So I'll just be very brief and just mention 2 quick points. So the first one is that earlier this year, CCICED released a report on green value chains. It was released in September of this year, and it looked at different aspects, particularly on soft commodities and challenges around zero deforestation, as well as looking at tools like traceability, third-party certification, and also the demand side is that to raise awareness among consumers of sustainability options. And then the second, just moving into right before Glasgow, China's State Council, which is the equivalent of their cabinet, released new guidance that includes climate risk assessments to be undertaken for their value chains. This, I think, is really important. The more details, which will be pending on that. I mentioned both of those. They can be found in links in the chat box. And there'll be other links as the discussions proceed. So with that as a very brief introduction, it's really my great pleasure to introduce our first panel speaker. Kathleen Mclaughlin is Executive Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer for Walmart Incorporated and President of Walmart Foundation. She has a much longer bio, which can also be found in the chat. She's a council member of CCICED, and we remain immensely grateful for your time during not only this meeting, but earlier meetings. So Kathleen, the floor is yours. Welcome and thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Scott. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody today. Thank you for having me. And, this Trade and Sustainability Hub of IISD is a really important opportunity for a great conversation about how we can work together in society across business and government and civil society to transform global supply chains to help achieve climate and nature goals, which are so pressing. And of course, circular economy is a big part of that. I think it's interesting that this really, comes on the heels of the Circular Economy Forum. These things are all related, and I'll talk about that a bit today. I thought I could provide some examples of how companies can play a role in transforming their value chains to achieve ambitious climate and nature and circular economy goals in partnership with others. And I'm going to make 4 key points. So the first is it is possible to pursue and achieve economic growth while also achieving the world's ambitious climate and nature goals. And I'm going to give just a few examples from Walmart and others. So at Walmart, we were the first retailer to set a science-based target for emissions reduction. And as of 2019, which is our last public reporting, we'll be reporting again soon on last year, we achieved a 12.1% reduction in our own scope 1 and 2 emissions. And this is while we were still growing quite strongly as a company. So that's just one example. It basically means we've had a 20% reduction in carbon intensity. Another example, there are similar dynamics when it comes to nature. For example, in row crops, so wheat, corn, rice, soy, fertilizer optimization has been a long-standing approach pursued by farmers to actually lower the cost of their production while improving yields and soil health and pollinator health and so on. So, that's another example where farmer economics can actually improve by taking care of the soil and helping to contribute to nature and climate goals. So these are just a couple examples. It's really important that we work together across sectors to innovate the way production happens at each stage of the supply chain so that we can achieve those outcomes and really optimize for environmental, economic, and social outcomes. And it does require innovation and a growth mindset. Second point is to shift our mindset from one of limiting negative impact to one of regeneration. We set a goal a little over a year ago now to become a regenerative company. And by that, we mean moving beyond sustainability, even as it's understood in some places as being limiting impact, to being a company that seeks to renew, restore, replenish people and planet. And so that does mean different practices interacting at the source of many commodities to not only better manage crop production in agriculture or forest commodities or commodities like tuna and so on that come from the ocean, but also to shift practices to restore pollinator health. I mentioned soil health, even conserve and restore degraded lands, conserve forests and so on as part of work at source to produce commodities. And there are huge benefits for climate and for nature in doing that, as well as for people working in those landscapes. And that's a different mindset. With the regenerative approach, we can open up exciting opportunities that really help grow our economies and build towards common prosperity that I know is a goal of so many of us in the conversation today, and protect our planet. The third point is that companies can play a special role in helping to translate broad societal ambitions like net zero by 2050 or restore 30% of the planet for nature into very practical, specific targets and actions, near-term operational targets, and then measure and disclose progress against those. I'll give a couple examples from Walmart. We've set operational targets within our own business to translate our science-based targets into what does that mean for our energy efficiency, refrigeration, transportation, emissions from our vehicles, on-site fuels to cook rotisserie chickens, all of those things, very practical. And we actually reset our science-based target to align with the 1.5 degree scenario and set a date of 2040 to get to zero emissions in our own scope 1 and 2. And then we've just broken it down into all of the work streams that our real estate people, our operators, our truck drivers, our logistics people, our merchants need to hit to ladder up to that overall goal. So we've got interim targets by 2025, for example. We want to be at 35% reduction in our scope 1 and 2 emissions and 65% by 2030 and so on. It's just easier for people to focus on something that's near term and then move on to the next. Another example, nature. That's, potentially quite hard to translate, but we've said, well, let's map back our commodities to source. So we did that across our supply chains, and we set a goal to help better manage, conserve, and restore 50 million acres of land and 1 million square miles of ocean in the ecosystems that are related to the products that our customers buy. So again, we've said, well, how do we tackle of ways we've done this? Partly, it's been through partnering with others on restoration at the intersection of commodity production. So, for example, we worked with World Wildlife Fund, Cargill, and McDonald's on a $6 million project with ranchers, cattle ranchers in the Great Plains, in Montana, the Dakotas, and so on, to still ranch, still produce beef, but to adopt practices in the grasslands that restore local ecosystems, better soil health, native grasses, pollinator health, and so on. So, that's an example, again, where you can have production, but be restoring vital local ecosystems. People call those place-based projects, and we have many of those going in different commodities around the world. And our long-term goal is to really shift toward that as the main way of production. We also announced recently a $10.8 million investment in the LEAF Coalition. That's the Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance Coalition. And so the intention of the coalition is to mobilize $1 billion in financing for tropical forest conservation and restoration. And we're excited to be part of that. It's going to help us invest at scale in solutions that are greatly needed in forests. Fourth, and what we're really focusing on today, is encouraging and helping people all along the supply chain build capabilities to transform. So you can imagine a retailer like Walmart, we sell so many different kinds of products. Our supply chain is very complex. It's global, and collaboration with people around the world is critical to achieve any of these goals. So we take what we call a shared value approach, meaning we believe that investing in those supply chains, even though we don't own or control them at all, but collaborating with others to encourage and support capability building for change is critical for the future surety of supply, for the quality of the products, for cost structure. In other words, again, economic prosperity depends on strengthening the environmental and social systems around the world. So we do this in a few ways. One is investing in projects at source, as I mentioned, for the sourcing with local farmers and ranchers and others. Second is building tools that our suppliers can use to achieve goals. We launched a project called Project Gigaton back in 2017 as an example, which helps suppliers reduce emissions and make progress on their own work toward emissions goals. We have over 3,000 suppliers participating in that, 500 million metric tons reported so far toward the billion goal in projects in energy, in waste reduction, in packaging, in forests, in agriculture, and so on. And there are a number of ways that we provide supports for that. In China, we launched in 2018 the same project with the goal of 50 million metric tons in China, which we're excited about. And so far, a couple of years in, we were at 10.5 million metric tons of emissions reported. So we think such initiatives are important. We've been also supporting through aggregate renewable energy purchasing programs with folks like Schneider Electric. HSBC offers preferential financing to suppliers who can demonstrate that they're participating in Gigaton, that they're setting science-based targets, and so on. So again, we're trying to provide these economic incentives as well as help people with the skills to get toward the goals of lower emissions. So that's it. I mean, just to wrap up, Scott, what I'd say is, we're just one company. This is a global effort. It requires everyone to work together. And discussions like this are so important because they help create a shared vision of what success looks like and excitement to work together. And, I'm hoping that what I've shared today sparks a few ideas and excited, to work with folks participating, and many of the folks here, we do work together today. So thank you for that collaboration.
Kathleen, thank you very much. That was really just fantastic. You really set up this panel really brilliantly. As usual, I always want to hear Kathleen about 3 times. So this panel is going to be recorded, and I'll want to go back. But I think just 2 things that are really striking, Kathleen, from what you've said. I mean, one is just thinking about innovation within supply chains. Is that central that innovation is climate and nature positive? This isn't an add-on, and it's integral to thinking about innovation. The second, just around science-based targets and moving to regeneration as opposed to do no harm. And then just, I think your last point is that we all know supply chains are immensely complicated. small and medium-sized businesses, important source of employment, and that looking at people and how to build capacity so that they can actually help meet the goals that are set at headquarters. And it sort of, I think what you've done is underscore just how important ambition is in Glasgow and in Kunming, but also this practical application. So with that, Kathy, thanks so much. And I hope you're able to say, I'm sure there'll be questions, but I think we'll move on to the next speaker. And I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Zhang Jian. Really impressive biography. He's Director General, Center for Regional Economic Cooperation and Director General, Institute for Western Asia and Africa at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and International Cooperation at MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce of China. Professor Zhang is also the Vice President of China Research Association of Social and Economic Systems and Professor of Economics at PKU Nankai University. Professor Zhang, very nice to see you again, and welcome. The floor is yours.
好的，谢谢主席。
Okay, thank you, Chair. And I would also
sorry,
like
may
to
I,
thank
Professor, sorry, just I apologize. I should have said at the beginning, for those of you listening, if you go in the box, there's simultaneous translation in English and Chinese, where you see in one of the changes in the box. So sorry, Professor Zhang, over to you again. I apologize.
对，我现在讲的是中文啊。
Okay, so I'm speaking Chinese. Yeah. Okay, so just now, I think our colleague from Walmart have given us very good experiences and practices as a multinational. And I am an old customer of Walmart because the closest supermarket to my home is actually a Walmart. And actually, in the recent 2 years, well, under the platform of the CCICED, we have studied many years of these global green supply chain and the issues related to the green supply chain, and how can multinational play a leading role in this. This is something, this is one of the research directions that we are currently engaging in. So I think I also have a very high expectation of the future practice of Walmart. I also would like to thank IISD and the CCICED for inviting me here to participate in today's forum.
10年前，当时由
Well, 10 years ago, I think Mr. Fokich, was the international team leader from IISD, and we conducted a study on the trade, investment, and the environment. At that time, I was in charge of studying on the environmental and social impact of Chinese enterprises that went overseas. And well, during that SPS study, we had very close contact with IISD. And well, we, together with IISD researchers, we also developed some policy document framework for Chinese companies to go global. And our electronic publication are also shared in the website of IISD at that time. So today, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about the green supply chain. So I think in 2016, on the platform of the CCICED, I started to study the issue of the global green supply chain. And at that time, WWF, Mr. Jim Dippers, the former president of WWF, was also engaged. And my proposition was that we should study all the commodities. So that we should include agriculture products, forestry products, and we should also look at the industrial manufactured goods or processed goods. But at that time, it was the first time that we had a study on the global green supply chain. So Mr. Jim Dipper, they wanted to look at soy as well as palm oil and marine products. So they were more interested in those products. So in our first SPS in 2016, we pay attention to these, big commodities, big agriculture and forestry commodities. And we also provided some policy recommendations to the State Council back then. And after that, every year, and in the platform of the CCICED, we continue to promote the global green supply chain research. And I personally have also been one of the Chinese experts in these studies. So from last year till now, I'm very pleased to see that the scope of our study on the global green supply chain has now covered also the manufactured goods, industrial processed goods. So CCICED also invited us to look at circular economy, and in particular, the role of circular economy in the global green supply chain. And CCICED asked us to offer some idea and observations. So for me, I think over the past 20 years or more, I have participated in development of the Clean Production Promotion Act and Circular Economy Promotion Law, as well as sustainable production and sustainable consumption research and studies. I have also witnessed the process of the two laws in the making. So basically, those two laws were also issued with the support of the ADB and with other international organizations. So I think in China, the Clean Energy Promotion Law as well as the Circular Economy Promotion Law are pretty unique, I think, compared to other countries. So this is quite a unique legal framework in China. On the basis of a legal requirement, well, China has also built these, so-called circular economy demonstration park, and in different demonstration parks, well, they are actually we actually try to link these, supply, link the upstream and the downstream together, so that the waste of the downstream and some of the residual product of the downstream of the upstream can become the feedstock of the downstream enterprises. So we can have a circular recycling of the resources, and we can also generate an industrial cluster which is environmentally friendly and resources friendly. So the fact has proven that over the past years' development, China has already achieved a lot of progress and success here. And regarding the resource efficiency in China, we believe that these practices have also contributed to the resource efficiency in China significantly. And in terms of the resource conservation and environmental protection, there are also progress in the taxation policies related to this. Now, China has these resource taxes, and also these environmental pollution discharge, charges have also turned into environmental taxes. And these two taxes can incentivize the enterprises to really promote the circular economy and promote the clean production, so that they can be more aligned with the more stringent environmental standards.
I
personally have done a lot of research of international trade, and I deeply feel that the International Division of Labor is becoming increasingly sophisticated and more well-defined. In the past, we divided the industrial jobs among countries, and then we later saw more well-defined division of labor within a product. And these days, we have done even more division of labor across different levels of the industrial sectors. So this requires due diligence, traceability system, standards, certification, and the labeling system, etc., so that we can make sure that in each section of the supply chain that we are working towards a consistent direction, and that is environmental protection as well as resource efficiency. Innovation and the scientific development, in fact, can do us a great favor, in particular the blockchain technology. So far as I know, in Beijing, the cold chain technology is already using the blockchain to do the product traceability. And also in China, we encourage the Chinese standards as well as the certification system to be integrated with the international standards as well as the traceability certification system, and to be interoperable as well as the mutual recognizable with each other. So much for my introduction because of the limit of time. Later, I'm willing to take more questions. Thank you very much.
Professor Zhang, thank you very, very much. That was really interesting. I mean, I think just three from your discussions, and I hope we'll have time for questions. I mean, one, just how important laws, regulations, and taxes are in driving and supporting change. And you can see that for those interested in the 14th five-year plan, some details around this. And then the second is this place-based or cluster approach to look at industrial clusters to align upstream and downstream, sort of similar to what Kathleen had raised on looking at place-based projects from the agricultural and other areas. And then third, which I know colleagues, I imagine Christina's been working on this, but just this certification, third-party certification, and the importance of having independent, but also, as you said, Professor Zhang, is that alignment or convergence of Chinese practices with international practices, I think is really, really important. So thank you. And this is really an excellent segue to move to our next speaker, which is who is Kevin Moss. Kevin is the Global Director of the Center for Sustainable Business at the World Resources Institute, which includes WRI's signature initiatives, as well as WRI's corporate consultative group. Also, Kevin played a significant role in the CCICED study I had mentioned on green supply chains, on looking at different examples of circular economy and their role in supply chains. So Kevin, thanks very, very much, and pleasure to see you, and the floor is yours.
Scott, thank you very much. And thank you to IISD and CCICED for including me here today. Kathleen and Professor Zhang, thank you for your remarks too. I'm at WRI, the World Resources Institute. We work at the intersection of planet and people. We see the environment as a resource to support human development, but one that has to be used in a way that is equitable for today's generations and that ensures it is sustainable and still there for future generations. I lead our work with the business community, cross-cutting across all of our different issues, but our work with business. And I come from the corporate sector myself prior to WRI. I should also mention, and a big thank you to Kathleen, who's on our board and is a wonderful support to our organization as well. I was very excited to participate in the CCICD special policy study on greening value chains. China has some important and valuable principles built into the 6 stabilities policy and the 14th five-year plan, as well as taking a very holistic approach. And all these together really lend themselves to the sorts of circular, harmonious solutions we need so badly. I think of value chains as having 3 components: the upstream component, or what we think of as the supply chain, a company's own operations, and the downstream component as we look towards the customer or the consumer. I'm not going to do a review of everything in the special policy study. I'm actually going to focus right in on one particular piece, which is the consumer, the consumption end. There's lots of really important work on upstream supply chains and on companies' own operations. And Kathleen talked about science-based targets and how these things can lead to so much really, really important action. And the CCICED study addressed soft commodity supply chains in particular. I'm going to group together supply chains, the upstream, and operations into sustainable production. And I'm going to accept that there's lots of great work going on in that area. But even with all the important work going on in that area, the pressure on our environmental resources are still going to be very high. We're up against the boundaries of the planet to provide for us now with the demand we have now. And as we bring and hope to bring billions of people out of poverty and into the middle classes around the world in the coming decades, with our current patterns of consumption, even with all of our improvements in sustainable production, we will still, if we continue those current patterns of consumption, grow our demand 3- to 4-fold. And the risk we collectively have to avoid is that we let our good work on sustainable production lead us to believe that we can still continue our current patterns of consumption. And the reality is we need to address both. So that's the little piece I want to focus on today. And it's a real dilemma for business. I sort of feel, as coming from a nonprofit, it's my job to focus on the really hard things, the things that are a dilemma. Our models for growth are traditionally focused on selling more stuff to more people more often. And this isn't just a dilemma for business, it's a dilemma for governments as well. And even us as individuals sort of think about, when am I going to go out shopping? When am I going to buy more stuff? What am I going to buy? And we need to transform that model. And it is a journey. We get caught today in a dilemma of what I think of as moral license. We've taken some green action, and so that enables me to go and buy some more stuff or eat some more meat because I didn't last week, rather than complement, meaning we have to do both. I just want to give you one example that illustrates the dilemma. H&M, a store many of you will have heard of, a global apparel chain, has fantastic signage in its stores encouraging people to reuse and recycle. There's actually an H&M store right near my office at Union Station in Washington, DC. I haven't been there for a while, but that's where it is. Right next to that reuse, recycle sign is another sign that says, we have new stuff coming in every day, so why don't you? That's an example of allowing the green action to be a moral license to continue the unsustainable activities. And I don't mean to pick on H&M, because I'm going to say something good about them later. They're just a great example of that dilemma. We've got to recycle and we've got to reduce, not see recycling as a reason to continue to grow consumption patterns. And don't get me wrong, I'm not calling for business or government to reduce growth and reduce economic growth. We've got to find other ways of developing our economic growth. And the sorts of things we've got to do at the consumption end is reselling used products, selling services instead of products, making a business out of repairing things. These might sound a little bit abstract, and indeed sometimes when I talk about this, I get a bit of a blank look back from companies or from governments or from individuals saying, really, you think that's something that's ever going to happen? So let me just give you a few concrete examples of where we're seeing that today. I'm going to start with H&M because I use them as an example of the dilemma. H&M is now piloting a store selling only used goods. That's all it sells. 2 or 3 years ago, to have said that to an apparel company that's in the middle of fast fashion, you should make a business out of selling used goods, would have been unheard of. I'd have probably been thrown out of the room. IKEA is piloting buying back, repairing and reselling furniture. Walmart, and it was great to have Kathleen talk about all those examples earlier. I'm going to add another one. Walmart has a partnership with ThreadUp. You can now buy secondhand clothing, used clothing, through Walmart's partnership with ThreadUp. In fact, if you're in front of your computer and you don't mind doing something different for a moment, you can just Google Walmart ThreadUp and you'll see how you do that. And so I don't keep all this so US focused. Alibaba has a platform, which I hope I pronounced correctly, called Shanyu, that is a used goods platform. And if you scroll to the very bottom of Amazon's webpage, Amazon has a section called Amazon Renewed that buys back used goods, and Amazon Second Chance that sells used goods. So things that we used to not even really think should be within the scope of what a company, traditional retail company does, there are now a lot of pilots and examples out there that we need to see scaled up. There are a number of implications of this. There are labor implications, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. There are trade and policy implications of doing this. And of course, there's an enormous consumer customer implication of how do we change the way consumers think about what it means to have a good life, the sort of life they aspire to. But what I just leave you with is I see this as a growth opportunity. I think if businesses are not exploring the market for their used products, a savvier competitor will capture the value of their used goods, and it'll be hard for them to wrestle it back. We need holistic solutions. We can't do these things alone. That's why WRI works with, and we actually host a partnership called PACE, Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy. And it doesn't mean less business. It means deriving our business opportunity in different ways. And this is the sort of level of change we need to get to the 75, 80, 90% reduction we need in carbon emissions, in water usage, in our pressures on the land over the coming decades. Thanks, Scott. Let me hand back to you for questions and to move on.
And thank you very much. That was just great. Thank you. I love that. I love the way you pose that, is that do the things we buy contribute to a good life, which is, lots of really interesting recent work by Dasgupta and others on how we think about broader issues of well-being. So Kevin, really just brilliant. Thank you so much. Let me, and also just to say, colleagues who are online, there's a couple of questions that have come into the chat box, and please feel free. And I'm going to turn to introduce the next panelist, who is Professor Tian Weifang, who is Senior Research Fellow, Institute of World Economics and Politics, China Academy of Social Science. Professor Tian is also Deputy Director and Senior Researcher of the World International Commodities Research Office of the Institute of World Economics and Politics, Chinese Academy.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share some my different perspective with all the experts here. I see in the three presentations about they focus more on the micro perspective, but here I would like to try to focus on the macro economic perspective. Since from my side, to deal with climate change is not only the business of company, it also needs governments to promote from the national side and also from the regional and the global side. So to enhance the regional cooperation and seize the trade opportunity to support green and low carbon growth is very important. So there is a significant potential to generate job growth, to provide a competitive advantage to reduce carbon emission in a cost-effective and people-centered way through regional cooperation. So I focus on 3 points: the opportunities, the challenges, and also some policy arrangement from the regional cooperation side. First, for the opportunity, we know new trade opportunity includes production and export of offshore solar, wind, and storage equipment and technology. All this new and green industry, and also trade in green goods such as electric vehicle and establish green supply chain. It also has an opportunity to decarbonization fossil fuel industry with technology such as CCUS. So all this the new and green opportunity, it may happen both in the national side and also in the regional side. Another outstanding and significant interregional cooperation issue is the perspective of extension transfer of IPR related to low carbon technologies. The cost of low carbon technology, such as solar, wind, hybrid vehicles, energy storage, are progressively getting cheaper over time. So the more technology is deployed, and the greater the reduction in cost. So we also can see other opportunities in the long run in low carbon goods and services, including integrating carbon markets, developing a clearly articulated financial strategy, and improved governance for promoting innovation and institutional capacity building. Great regional cooperation also creates new cost-effective implementation of NDRC targets through mature learning among countries. So all this are the opportunities arise within low carbon action. The challenges are also very obvious. The integration of regional markets is a prerequisite for reducing the cost of climate change mitigation, but there are lots of challenges. For example, the new aggressive emission targets for NDCs incorporate 26 and net zero emission can create incentive for polluting and high carbon industries to move to developing countries, which has less ambitious emission caps. And we can see this is a carbon linkage. It may happen. In addition, the border tax adjustment arising in EU and also in US in discussion currently can be considered by some advanced countries, could have consequences for access to other export markets that were previously open to developing countries. This is the very important policy. It may have quite a different influence for different countries, since trade connects all countries together. And furthermore, establishing efficient and green regional markets requires infrastructure standardization and changes and in regularly measures which take time to be developed and unified. So all this are some challenges that we can see currently. So what kind of policy the government can do? If we see Asia country, ASEAN and East Asia leader actually have already reached a high level of consensus, regional economic integration, and on the importance of tackling climate change. I can give some experience from this side. We know that in Asia, there are lots of regional cooperation mechanisms like ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint and also RCEP. These are promoting Western domestic markets that provide excellent conditions for the formation of new green supply chain and new green industry. So from the regional cooperation of ASEAN or from RCEP, following action should be taken to accelerate the green supply chain cooperation. Firstly, liberalization of trade and reduce tariff would overcome cost barriers and accelerate innovation and technology transfer. And country will benefit from policies such as energy efficiency standards, labors, and certification for low carbon goods only if non-tariff barriers in their trade regimes are removed. So policies on innovation, IPRs, trade, and FDIs play a very important role in this progress. So secondly, the exchange of knowledge about how to overcome this challenge will be mutually beneficial, particularly about least cost technology innovation and adoption, reform progress, and the minimization of mitigation costs. So in this process, policy coordination among developing countries, emerging economy, as well as with developed economies may reduce the prospect of interregional shift of a high carbon industry and interregional carbon linkage. So policy coordination, I would like to emphasize, are very important in such a crucial time. Third, the industries and research institutes in developing countries could be involved in regional collaboration partnership from the R&D stage and the extension of green supply chain. Enhancing cross-border energy through like a great interconnectivity may lead to a very different cost-efficient outcome in terms of renewable energy integration and mobilization private finance. So private finance and the involvement of private sector are very important in this issue. So this is my presentation, and I will also welcome comments and discussions. Thank you.
Professor Jian, thank you very, very much. That was Very comprehensive and helpful. Thank you. I'll just mention, you mentioned border carbon adjustment, and in this IISD Trade and Sustainability Hub, there's a special session just on that topic. And I believe other sessions will be looking at some of the other important questions you raised, the role of trade agreements like RCEP and also CPTPP, whether they can accelerate greening of supply chains and circular economy through how they treat tariffs or the adoption of common standards and others. So Professor Jian, thank you very, very much. We're going to go to our last speaker, and really delighted to welcome you. I'll mention that Canada actually was the host of the World Circular Economy Forum in earlier this year in 2021, and Shannon Castellet is the manager of the Policy and Instrument Development section within the Plastics Regulatory Affairs Division and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Shannon is responsible for managing the development of single-use plastics regulations. Shannon, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you, Scott. I do have a presentation that I will load up, if that's okay, just to help guide the discussion. Before I start, can everyone see this presentation?
Not yet, but I think I'm sure Sam and Joe and others are uploading this as we're speaking.
How's that?
There we go. Yeah, great.
Okay. So thank you. So I am happy to be here to be part of this panel, and I will be providing a bit of a different perspective on the circular economy. And it's certainly one where it's really looking at what is the role that the government can play. So this slide here, it's really intended to provide a snapshot of the plastics economy in Canada. It is based on a study that Environment and Climate Change Canada commissioned a few years ago. And the real takeaway from this is just the linearity in terms of flow. So this is really where the majority of plastics in the Canadian economy are going to landfill. And we really only have about 9% that's recycled. So we also looked into what are the reasons that we're having, why we have such linearity, and what are the barriers to really getting that circular economy. And we do have some of them listed here, and I will just highlight quickly. So some of it is we just don't have the infrastructure. We have recyclers who have to compete with producers of sort of traditional producers of plastic resin. On the recycling side, we don't have collection rates that are as high as they could be. We don't always have the technology to be able to sort and to recover these resins. And then the third thing too is it's the investment. A lot of times the management of waste and certainly the cost of pollution, it is shouldered by our communities, our local communities. So that said, Canada does have an ambitious agenda, and we've heard of some of these themes today, and it's one where we're really looking at a future that's zero plastic waste by 2030. And so a few of the takeaways from this is there's no real single solution, and we've heard some of this today, where it's really, you know, initiatives at from all perspectives along the value chain, and it's also a number of actions that truly will be needed. And another thing too, certainly for Canada, is that as we're moving forward with design, we really want to, you know, embrace the concepts of the waste management hierarchy. And it's really where, you know, it's important to look at what is it that we can do to kind of get at those upper echelons where we're looking at, you know, areas of prevention. So we reduce, you know, we repair. Value recovery is also important, but if we're really looking at sort of that real systemic change, it needs to be where the interventions come at a higher point in this risk management or this waste management hierarchy. So Canada does have an ambitious agenda, and this really lists a number of the actions where we're engaged. So we have actions internationally, the Oceans Plastic Charter certainly being a very prominent one for Canada. We also take action within our provinces and territories where we work alongside them, and we have an action plans where we list a lot of concrete actions. This area that's highlighted, policies and regulations. So this is where my team works and where we have our specialty. And it's really looking at, where is it that government needs to intervene and really needs to develop instruments to manage plastic waste and pollution, and also put mechanisms in place to really support towards that circularity in our economy. And there's other initiatives here that are also very important for supporting our growth and our movement forward. And that includes investing in science. So Canada has a plastic science agenda and really looking at innovation. And Canada also has a number of initiatives underway to really encourage that. So my team really looks at regulations and what we can do to move forward. And this is really where we take a very evidenced approach to the things we do. So this snapshot really looks at a number of actions that have occurred since last fall. So last year we published a science assessment. And so this is where we really looked at the time, what was the state of play of all the information and the data out there related to how plastics are behaving in our environment. And so what we found is that there is a need to take action. And so from there, we published a discussion paper. And this discussion paper really highlighted a few key areas where we want to move forward. So the first was we really have a framework for looking at, for things like packaging and single-use plastics, how is it that the government wants to prioritize them? What are some where we really, need to get out of the business and we need to regulate versus others where, there are other mechanisms where we can look at collaboration and agreements to move forward to ensure that the impact from these items is reduced. Other things we talked about is establishing performance standards. So the need for recycled content requirements. And then the last piece we looked at, it's really how do we have guidance to really build in a bit of accountability to ensure some extended responsibility requirements. And so this is where, just to kind of look at, it really shows, how is the integration among all the things that we're doing? So, as sort of government, we really, scan, we look at, what is the information out there telling us, but whether it be from an economic perspective, what is the science telling us? And where is that we need to send the signal of where we want to take action? So I think this is where, the government can kind of set that tone. And then, as we've heard here, there are a number of actions that can really be taken to innovate and to really help drive towards that, and this is where, sort of industry knows their business best, and researchers can really help in building those new solutions. And it's always with, the goal of kind of meeting, those government targets. And so I think, the more that governments can be clear in terms of, expectations and where we are going, I think that will really help guide some of that innovation. And then the other role, certainly for Canadians, but I think just in general, it's really looking at, practices and how do we shift some of the paradigms. And, I think Ken kind of addressed some of this and some of his examples of looking at, how is that we get people, to maybe look at the choices they're making, to make better choices. Certainly in Canada, I pointed to the fact that our recycling is an area of improvement. So, how can we focus on maybe getting a bit more of that, really that integration sort of among Canadians and ultimately sort of avoiding litter. So I will stop there. So thank you again. I really appreciate being part of this panel and sort of bringing a very different perspective to the discussion.
Great, wonderful, Kathleen. Thank you very, very much. Really, really helpful because I think it complements this sort of taking a sort of a wide strategic focus, but then looking at the complexity of detailed actions, both from government regulations and also from, as you've said, the private sector that know best about their own supply chains, and underscores both what Kathleen and Kevin and others have said, the role of consumers in looking at this. We're going to have two discussants and then we're going to go, we're going to wrap up on time, I promise. we're going to go to a couple of questions, but before that, we have two discussants, and both of them really excellent. So the first is Dr. Guillermo Castellea, who is a CCICED special advisor. Really grateful. He co-led with Kathleen earlier this year an informal dialogue that CCICD hosted on sustainable food systems immediately before the UN Global Food Summit. And then from that work, Guillermo will be co-chairing a newly formed formal group on the topic of sustainable food systems, which is obviously a critical part of the topic we're talking about today. Guillermo has been really long distinguished career, a senior advisor at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, a senior fellow at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, executive director of conservation at WWF International, and many other experience. So Guillermo, very nice to see you from your new apartment in Paris. We're all coming to visit you after this panel, whenever travel resumes. So Guillermo, over to you, and thank you. Welcome.
You're all welcome to come. So thank you, Scott. All right, so I think that what we've heard from the panelists is really encouraging. I would say not only we understand the value of supply chains, but we also understand how far they can go and how much good they can provide. So the question therefore is the efficiency with which supply chains work, how this efficiency and how this sophistication can be used to generate a regenerative economy, the way Kathleen was mentioning, or whether the incentives will go in the other direction and will accelerate the destruction. So efficiency can work both ways. So the question is, if we believe that supply chains, and I completely buy that argument that supply chains are a force for good, could be a force for good, we need to understand what makes it switch from being a bad thing to being a good thing. And so I think that's something that we need to grapple with, because so far we have only seen most of it. We have seen the efficiency with which resources are dilapidated. So I think that if we're going to see the reverse using the same tool, we need to understand on what are we basing our beliefs. And I think that the examples that we've heard so far about actions on the terrain are very encouraging, because you can see, particularly coming from Walmart, the capacity to leverage at scale is just formidable. Now, I'm not going to comment more on that. What I'd like to just bring is a higher level perspective about how I see supply chains fitting together with that global agenda. I think that in order to get supply chains do the right thing, something is important other than the examples on the ground, and that is the alignment of objectives and outcomes that different stakeholders have. Supply chains cannot be managed only by one organization, and then everybody else will follow suit. Supply chain reform requires the stakeholders of the supply chain to come together and ask the hard questions and deal with the hard issues and try to find solutions that will make sense, not only for their specific part of the supply chain, but for the overall system that the supply chain is feeding into. So I think my plea is to always think about how supply chains are feeding into something else, because that something else will ultimately drive the success or not of the reforms of the supply chain. Take, for instance, soy. China is buying a lot of soy from Brazil. There's deforestation that may be resulting from that type of business. If we just focus on deforestation and we try to figure out how certification and how some kind of commitments from the industry can help solve the problem, we might not be focusing on the real problem, which is how is China going to feed and provide protein to its growing population and growing demand over the next 25 years. So if we shift the question from how can we prevent more deforestation, to how can we help China meet its demand for protein, you get a completely different set of answers. So I think that my plea is to make sure that we are looking at the supply chain as a whole. And that as part of that supply chain analysis, we can then start thinking about how the amendments in the supply chain can help us get closer to the overall goal that the world is trying to achieve. And lastly, I would like to say that I don't believe that we have the right governance structures to deal with this. Something that we need to, or actually develop, is these new formulations, maybe regional, maybe at a different level, by commodity, by sector. But we need to bring together all the right stakeholders. We need to bring the data, we need to bring the evidence, and we need to bring the systems perspective that will allow us to understand what are the trade-offs that need to be made, so that those trade-offs can be translated into politics and policy. And it is then that we can see how the supply chains will favor this movement towards the better or not.
Guillermo, brilliant. Thank you very, very much. I mean, I think just this is a perfect segue. Where you mentioned the importance of data and evidence, and then I wanted to go back to your question on the time we have, and perhaps begin with Kathleen with a couple of questions. But I think this question of a systemic approach, you know, what we have on in following supply chains is a specific focus on a hotspot in Indonesia or Malaysia or Brazil. There's a response, but I think, Guillermo, your point is that what are the underlying drivers, both from the supply and demand, and what's the system to approach this? But let me turn to our last discussion first. So it's really interesting. So just to say, I'm really delighted to welcome Cristina Larea. Cristina is the lead of sustainability standards in the economic law and policy program of IISD. Her work, she does, I look at your website probably once every week or so. There's a series of global market reports on specific commodities, soy, cotton, palm oil, other goods and services, as well as an annual State of Sustainability Standards report. And Cristina, really delighted to see you, so welcome, thank you.
Thanks very much, Scott, for the nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be in this very important panel, and thanks all the speakers for the valuable interventions. I would like to share 3 points based on my experience at IISD working on sustainability standards and global value chains. First, and echoing what the speakers already mentioned, is that we don't have other options than supporting global value chains to greening their operations. Either driving by regulations such as due diligence requirements, incentives, consumer behaviors, social pressure, or investment criteria or company commitments. Value chain actors are and will increasingly transition to more sustainable operations and willing to influence those other suppliers. And this implies at least 2 things from our experience at IISD. First, identifying and addressing risk, such as deforestation, biodiversity loss, pollution, due to a number of issues such as overuse of fertilizers or use of plastics from the country of origin of the raw material all the way to the retail. But not only identifying risks to manage them and address them, but also deliver positive outcomes, as the other speakers mentioned, the regenerative agriculture or regenerative practices, and being able to collect, measure, and disclose relative data that could be third-party verified. And I think this is very important because what we see in few years to come, value chain actors will need to report what they do to manage risk, but also what they do good, and being able to demonstrate that information, for instance, recycle rate of waste materials or CO2 emissions. The second point that I would like to say that for that to happen, increasingly we've seen the last 5-10 years, and we hope to see that more, that value chain actors are leveraging technology, in particular traceability systems, to first map their value chain. Who are the actors in that value chain? You know, from cotton sourcing in India, Bangladesh to retail in Sweden, or from soy in Brazil to retailers in China. Who are the actors? And that's not an easy task to do. And we increasingly see that this is happening using different technologies, as well as collect and share data concerning risk, product characteristics, market trends, as well as environmental impact. And this is an opportunity and it's already happening, but it's also a challenge since sharing data between businesses is sometimes it's confidential, it has some considerations. So as we have seen today in these panels, there is already important activities and examples, you know, that are taking place of private sector actors and government support towards these efforts. We also have voluntary sustainability standards. As we know, they have implemented traceability systems, mainly based on paper, to be able to identify the source and origin of the crop, collect sustainability related information, and share that with different actors all the way to consumers to be able to reassure product integrity and sustainability claims of the product. Normally, these traceability systems have been used in paper, but increasingly, we see examples of leveraging technology for that purpose. And I would like to cite two examples. First of all, Forest Stewardship Council, which, for instance, a couple of years ago, they launched a geospatial information portal that allows to monitor in real time timber operations and be able to see and to validate tree cover or forest conservation areas. And that information could be put available in real time to different actors, value chain actors, as well as consumers. Or different value chain actors are working with organic certification to be able to conduct DNA traceability in the cotton fibers and for being able to demonstrate the presence of non-GMO products. So there are activities and initiatives out there that we could learn from, identify best practices to influence how we can green value chains through the use of traceability. And my last point, and echoing what Kevin mentioned earlier on the importance of sustainable consumption. In our research at IISD, we see that there is increasing awareness towards purchasing, goods that come from more sustainable production systems, as well as reuse or recycled goods. But still, we need to do more work on explicitly mention the value of purchasing these products for consumers as well as buyers, providing incentives to consume recycled goods as well as products that come from sustainable sources. And last but not least, we see that consumers are very price sensitive, in particularly in emerging economies such as China. So how can we address this issue of price at consumer end? Thanks very much, and looking forward for the discussion.
Great. Christina, thank you very, very much. That was excellent. Colleagues, we have about 8 minutes. There's some questions that come in, and I'm going to start maybe with Kathleen, but also anyone else who would like to answer after Kathleen. And it's really, Kathleen, we all either were at Glasgow or followed Glasgow. And I think what was quite striking, you've mentioned, is just the role of the private sector in making commitments on net zero, deforestation, and other commitments. The Secretary General has said, promising is easy, implementation is hard. There's a proposal for the SG to have a monitoring and evaluation system. So the first question is, what do you think about that, having a UN type of agency to look at corporate promises? And then the second one is, I think you provided some examples, but what might be examples where Walmart has helped your suppliers in capacity in other ways? And then the second part of that is, what do you do with non-achievement or non-compliance in a supplier? So those are a set of questions to you, Kathleen. Thanks.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, I'll try to answer those in 2 minutes to give time to others. On the first one, if we're talking about climate specifically, I think a good model is actually the financial sector or just industry in general, right? So we have globally accepted accounting principles that are set out by a standard setting body companies adhere to those, and there is a regulatory and legal oversight apparatus in every jurisdiction. So for example, domiciled in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission oversees our financial filings. And people don't go off and disclose counter to that. That defines what you disclose, how you disclose, what the rules are. And we see the same thing emerging in climate. So emission standards, what's the way that you measure and disclose? And the SEC right now had a comment letter out this year, and they're about to come back with new regulations. I think we're going to see them move toward requiring disclosures in a standardized format in filings. And to me, that's your accountability mechanism. So if you've made a zero emissions pledge, you're disclosing every year in accordance with those standards. It's required. And I think that's the simplest way. I don't know that it makes sense to set up some other body that's going to go around and ask for paperwork and so on to confirm. If you could just embed it in our existing accountability structures. So that's that one. Then in terms of supporting suppliers, there's a broad array of supports. So for example, workshops to help people with NGOs, we've hosted them to even set targets, ideally science-based targets, and then to help them if they've got an issue making the case to their board or their leadership team and so on. And then a whole broad set of supports in each of the pillars. So energy, waste, packaging, agriculture, forest, product design. For example, we made a public investment in a tool called Plastic IQ to create a tool for consumer goods companies to figure out what's the optimal packaging for their use case. Sometimes it's no packaging, but how to design for recyclability or reuse and refill models and so on. We made that available as a public good. And our data shows that about 10% of at least the US consumer industry is actually actively using that tool. For our own suppliers, we also, as another example, did a deal with Schneider Electric to offer aggregate PPA, power purchase agreement capability for renewable energy to suppliers who might not have their own renewable energy procurement team. And then, so that's a way for them to participate. And then in terms of incentives, we have different levels of recognition in Project Gigaton. So for example, Gigaguru, if you've set a science-based target and so on, and we've asked each of our suppliers to engage and ratchet up their own ambition. We track that, we disclose that. And I'm happy to say that we, as I mentioned, we have over 3,000 suppliers participating. The most recent numbers even higher. We'll be disclosing that soon. It is well over 70% of our supplier base is engaged in that program. So we've had no trouble getting people engaged and working on it because they see the value and make the case of that value to them. I would encourage folks, I put it in the chat, to our ESG report. Our climate issue brief goes into depth on this and provides additional examples of exactly how we work with suppliers on these type of programs.
Great, Kathleen, thanks very much. Kevin, I think I saw your hand up. Did you want to jump in on this?
Sure. If there's time, if you wanted to move on, I wanted to give you that option too. So just a couple of thoughts. I think for me, one of the most important things that came out of COP is to ensure, and Kathleen referred to this as well, we get the balance right between voluntary contributions from companies and voluntary commitments, but don't let that prevent us from also putting government mandates and regulation in place as well. As I see it, I like the term ambition loop. These corporate, these bold corporate commitments that Walmart and so many others and some others have made should be an encouragement to government to be able to raise their levels of ambition, not in place of government doing it. So I think that's an important part of our theory of change. Absolutely, we have to hold companies accountable for the commitments they make. Science-based, for actually delivering against them. Science-Based Targets Initiative will be adding that to its work. Who is the right organization to do it for all of our issues across all of the commitments is whichever organizations have the right level of independence and can move quickly. But I also want to make sure we don't focus so much on the companies that have made commitments that we ignore the millions of companies that haven't made any commitments. We need to get that. That's a balance question. We could put all our focus on bashing the companies that said they'd achieve 90% and only achieved 88, who are fantastic, and ignore the companies that did nothing if we're not careful. So it's like everything, it is a question of getting the balance right.
Great. we have a lot of questions and we have no more time. So rather than, I'll just say, just on your point that we heard from both Professor Zhang and Professor Jian on China's emerging approach, including the role of regulations and compliance markets, for example. Just to underscore your point, Kevin, is that the role of public policy and government in this. There was a question for which we won't have time, just reactions from the EU's as proposed approach on regulations for zero deforestation in supply chains, but we'll have to leave that for another time because I promised to wind this up on time. So it really just to say thanks to everyone, to our 5 panelists, to our 2 discussants, to everybody that has joined, to IISD, to CCICED, colleagues in Beijing are online as well. As I'd mentioned, this panel is being recorded. And we will have this posted in the next couple of, probably later today. So just to say to everyone, I very much look forward to continuing to work with you, Professor Zhang and Professor Jian and colleagues as well. So thanks very, very much for really a really rich and interesting discussion. So thank you.